Taip, labas rytas. Aš norėčiau pranešti, kad dabar vyksta konferencija stiprinant visuomenės pasipriešinimą prieš hibridinės grėsmes Baltijos jūros regione ir organizuojam paraleliai Spaudos konferenciją. Tik tai norėčiau įspėti, kad mūsų svečiai kalbės anglų kalba ir nėra organizuotas vertimas į lietuvių kalbą paralelinis. Tai bus, prašau, klausimus užduoti lietuvių kalba. Tai pirmiausia, aš juos pristatysiu, o paskui kiekvienas iš jų po 4 minutės pasakys žinutę, ką jie nori papasakoti, ir tada bus laiko klausimams atsakymams. Okay, now I will switch to English, and I would like to introduce Dr. Michael Carpenter, and he's a senior director of the Joseph Biden Center of Diplomacy and Global Engagement at the University of Pennsylvania. And he is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense with the responsibility of Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. We also have a guest, Colonel Samuel Gardiner, and he's a retired U.S. Air Force colonel who has taught strategy and military operations at the National War College and also Air War College and Naval War College. And he was recently visiting scholar at the Swedish Defense College, and he has very broad experience about Russia and about security in the region. And also the last but not least guest, we have Brigadier General Yaroslav Krashevsky, and he started his military career in 1988, and now he works for Polish President's office for the department which is responsible for the supervision and development of Polish armed forces. So now I would like to invite Dr. Carpenter to start briefing.
Great, thank you, Vaidotas. And I'll be brief at the outset. I'll just make a few introductory comments, and I'll leave plenty of time for questions and answers. First of all, it's great to be back in Vilnius, back discussing defense and security issues. We are obviously in a very interesting time right now. We have a new administration in the United States. I think the good news for this region is that a lot of the NATO adaptation efforts that were begun in the Obama-Biden administration are being continued both under NATO auspices, but also bilaterally with the Defense Department in terms of the deployment of an armed brigade combat team to Eastern Europe, as well as changes to our force posture and pre-positioning of equipment here in Eastern Europe that is designed to deter and enhance defense capabilities for our allies in the East. I think as we look forward at the security landscape, both in this region but also more broadly into the future, it is clear that we, in addition to focusing on deterrence for threats on the higher levels of the escalation ladder, must also look increasingly at threats at the lower rungs of the escalation ladder. And by what I mean by that is both adapting our militaries to deal with the sorts of hybrid threats that were encountered in Ukraine with the so-called little green men, but also levels of political subversion that go even a level below that of little green men. And we have seen, unfortunately, in my own country, in the course of the last 6 to 12 months, that political subversion is cheaper and easier to perpetrate than military action, and that Russia is capable of using this type of activity, even in my own country, even in the United States, with its unprecedented cyber attack and interference in our electoral process during the presidential election campaign. I think if you look at some of the recent developments across Europe, with, again, Russia fomenting a plot in Montenegro to seek to undermine the election there in October, to derail the country's prospects for NATO membership, I think one sees that the use of political subversion combined with certain types of activity, particularly in the cyber domain, but not exclusively linked as well to propaganda, that this is increasingly becoming a threat to the sovereign countries in the European space, and includes, of course, the Baltic region as well. So Russian propaganda is at an all-time high. Fake news is now something that we all live with each and every day, including in the United States. By the way, this is no longer just a phenomenon that we encounter here in Eastern Europe and the Baltic region. It is something that we encounter in all of our Western democracies. What we're really seeing is the attempt by actors in Russia to turn what are typically the core strengths of open Western liberal democracies into weaknesses, and to use asymmetric means to do that. So we're seeing the use or the manipulation of political pluralism in Western societies by actors from Russia to seek to finance either political parties or candidates or groups that are anti-establishment or anti-NATO or anti-EU. We see the use of manipulation of free markets to forge corrupt ties to corporations and business interests to advance the Kremlin's policy lines. And then we see the manipulation of the mass media to sow propaganda and discord, as we saw in our own electoral cycle, once again, with very carefully timed releases of both information that was gleaned through cyber attacks, but then also fake news trolling to shift the agenda and to undermine confidence in the electoral system. So unfortunately, these are issues that we're going to have to all deal with into the future, but it requires that Western societies now adopt a more sort of comprehensive policy of resilience building that is focused not just on the higher end military threats, as I referred to earlier, but that also deals with some of these other types of threats, which are just as subversive, if not more so, than the military ones. I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to take your questions later on.
Michael started with some good news. Let me start with bad news. I think I would make the argument that the Baltic states have a reason to be concerned about what's unfolding in Washington. Let me go through some of that and explain what I have in mind. The first thing is that if political sciences have done lots of studies about the span of attention of policymakers, and the answer is 10. Policymakers, for the most part, can handle 10 issues at a time. Beyond that, they don't make the agenda. If you look at what the United States is facing right now, I have to say that the Baltic states don't make the list of the top 10. Let me start with what's happening in NATO, and then I'll talk about the others. If you'll notice that when the American leadership, the Secretary of Defense, the Vice President, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs came to Europe to talk about the U.S. commitment to NATO, they talked about spending. Everybody needs to meet the 2% goal in spending. They didn't talk about the threat. If you'll notice in the speeches, nobody said the reason you need to spend 2% is because Russia is a threat. The 2% seems to be an objective, an end in itself, not an objective that is focused sharply on what the Baltic states are facing themselves. So that's the first thing. NATO is on the agenda of the top 10. But if you look at the others, on Tuesday, we're told that there was a meeting in the White House over the military options for dealing with Korea. Some of the press is reporting that even regime change is on the list. To NATO and to the Baltic states, that's a prior priority for the United States. The United States now has a carrier battle group in the South China Sea. The Chinese are just about to finish putting in their air defense system on the islands. That is a higher priority for the United States than the Baltic states. So that's the first trend is in those areas. Probably I would be mistaken if I didn't add the Middle East. Again, a higher priority. It seems as if the administration is willing to let the INF treaty proceed on and are not going to challenge it the way had been suggested during the campaign. But there is the open question to be decided probably within a week is how many additional troops the United States will send to Iraq and Syria. That is more important than the Baltic states. You can make the list go on and on. Israel, Mexico, the list is long. So that's the first problem. The second problem is centralization. What is beginning to unfold in the new U.S. administration is the idea, is the concept that more centralization of national security decision-making will be done by the White House. That's not new. In fact, some of the many criticisms that the Obama administration got was because of too much over-centralization. But let me give you an example of the problem that has. And again, it goes back to my notion of limited agenda. When Putin declared that the passports of the eastern Ukraine would be honored, the French, the Germans, and the EU issued formal objections. The EU said, we will not accept that, that is unacceptable. The United States response was a tweet from the embassy in the Ukraine saying this didn't match the Minsk agreement. That is a characteristic of too much centralization. Follows from that is where the State Department is right now. There are over 200 positions in the U.S. State Department that are unfilled. As a former teacher, I have lots of students who are out in embassies, and I hear from them, we don't know what we're doing. We get no guidance. It will only be next week when the State Department has its first daily briefing. In other words, the administration has been in office this long, and the State Department hasn't connected with the press. So these issues that the United States is facing continue to make it more complex and more difficult to find any optimism about focus on the Baltic states. That doesn't mean it can't be overcome. That doesn't mean that there isn't a way to get to the agenda. But as of right now, the agenda doesn't look good for the Baltic states.
Okay, I'm only one military person in this group, so let me share the Polish point of view from the military perspective. First of all, the Polish standpoint is that we need to have dialogue with Russia, but the dialogue doesn't mean cooperation. Before we start the dialogue with Russia, Poland wants to have the solid foundation to do so. The solid foundation is, first of all, the clear statement that Baltic states, all the Baltic states, are unified and strong. It was spoken about 2% of GDP spending on the defense. So we have to clarify what kind of capabilities we need in the military of the Baltic states. Secondly, we have to do a lot of training activities, training events, just to clarify all the procedures regarding the rapid reaction. Next point is that to be strong and unified, yes, we are part of NATO, we are part of European Union, but Baltic states plus Poland, we need to sit down at the table and compare the best capabilities to be assigned for the rapid reaction against any threats in the Baltic region. The next point, we spoke about this yesterday, we have to clarify the full scope of hybrid threats which could touch the Baltic region, because everybody speaks about the hybrid, but there has to be clear definition about the hybrid threats in the Baltic region. If we start the dialogue, the next point for Baltic states military is the clear, transparent, and robust command and control system. It's a very difficult challenge we have to face, but such meetings, such conferences like today's one is a good foundation to clarify all the requirements we need to have in our national military. Also, we have to build up a solid posture of the national home defense forces to be able to combine them with EFP and ABCT from US, which is already deployed in Poland. Going further, from the national perspective, allied joint operations is about basic foundation we have to keep in our minds. So firstly, national defense forces will take responsibility about the threats, and secondly, we have to be ready to hand over responsibility for the allied headquarters coming to this region. Next point is unity of efforts. So if we have all the Baltic states, our military capabilities compared and declared for the rapid reactions, that's the basic foundation to have unified efforts. Next point, it's a rapid reaction. We spoke yesterday about the military Schengen zone. That's the mandatory thing, and based on the most recent declarations coming from the ministerial meetings of NATO, it's going to be done on the base of 24/7. So military equipment together with the ammunition could be transferred immediately from point A to point B for rapid engagement. That's the basic declaration for all the Baltic states. All those things together create the conditions that in the nearest future we will be able to face any hybrid threats, including the cyber defense. The last one, we have to take advantage of the Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, which is deployed already in Baltic region, and send our civilian and military personnel to get some training activities in this Center of Excellence. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now we have 5 minutes for question and answers. So, journalists, you are welcome to ask questions.
Can I start then? I'm from National Radio of Lithuania, Giedre. And what would be your suggestion for Lithuania and Baltic region to get into the agenda of new US administration?
I'll try. You understand? You have to yell. The Lithuanians have to yell. It's time not to be quiet. And in fact, one of the reasons for having this conference is to talk about doing some war games, crisis simulations about the future. Understanding the storyline, both in Lithuania, the region, Europe, and for the United States, in this important way to get toward the agenda. There are reasons to be on the agenda, and it's time to find the reasons to get to the agenda.
So the only thing I would add to that is that one has to recognize that right now in the United States, we face a rather unprecedented duality and mixed messaging in terms of what is being said at the very top levels of our government. On the one hand, you hear Mr. Trump saying that NATO is obsolete and talking about his desire to cozy up to Mr. Putin and establish a great relationship. It's unclear what the contours of that would be or what the substance would be as far as any sort of rapprochement or relationship with Russia that would be good. But at the same time, you have his very own Secretary of Defense saying that he understands that Russia is trying to break apart NATO, that NATO is essential, and that we need to continue to strengthen the alliance. So you have certain individuals within the cabinet, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Advisors, and the Vice President, I would add, saying one thing, but then you have members of this inner circle around Mr. Trump, some of his personal advisors, saying something very different. What that means for Lithuania, though, and for the other Baltic states is you need to work with the professionals in our system. We have some ideologues around Mr. Trump who, frankly, I think have espoused some rather dangerous views about Russia and about its role in the region. But what the countries here and what the leaders here need to do is engage the professionals, engage people like Secretary of Defense Mattis, talk to the professionals in the Joint Staff, in the Pentagon, about your needs and how it is that you want to continue to support U.S. force posture in the eastern part of Europe. That's where you're going to have your most productive conversations. And you know, we'll see. We're in an unprecedented time in terms of what's happening in the United States. And there are a lot of now voices calling for an independent special prosecutor to investigate the ties between the Trump administration and Russia. But that will play itself out. And, you know, that shouldn't be the primary concern for, it is a concern for all of us, but that shouldn't be the primary concern for leadership here. Leadership here should seek to engage both in the Department of State and in the Defense Department and other agencies at the professional level, because that's where you have people that really know their brief and that are not ideologically tinged based on connections to Russia that at this point, frankly, remain very murky.
Okay, we have time for one more question, the last one. Okay, thank you. Ačiū. Thank you, excellent.